Let's explore the topic of judgment through the lens of Trek and come to a ruling on the...
Yeah, it's the best five, worst five, know what I mean? Yeah, it's the best five, worst five Trek's ever seen.
Even most of the worst entries in this ranking aren't all that bad, but in the grand scheme of lists, something's got to be the worst. The fifth least favorable courtroom scene, Angel 1 death sentence. While this isn't a formal courtroom scene, the death sentence passed down by the planet's ruler, Mistress Beata, certainly fits the category of judgments being passed. She does give the survivors of the ship Odin a chance to leave, so there's some measure of actual justice being handed down. Riker proves his negotiating skills and gets the two sides to see the compromise of exile. Terrible episode, but mediocre wisdom shown by the planet's ruling mistress. Number 4. O'Brien must suffer. When the Cardassians snatch DS9's operations chief, Miles O'Brien, it doesn't make any sense. Start to finish, you'd think if the Cardassian government was going to go after someone in Starfleet to create a false narrative against, that it might be a commissioned officer? This entry exposes the sham nature of the Cardassian legal system, where the verdict is known before the trial begins. And when your lawyer wins his first case ever, he's going to be disappeared forever for something that had nothing to do with him. Of all Miles O'Brien's moments of suffering, this was the most unnecessary. Number 3. B'Elanna's violent thoughts. The Dream Police are a real thing among the race known as the Mari. In the city where Voyager has sent an away team to trade, the city's chief examiner, Namira, is pretty much judge, jury, and executioner all rolled into one. When Torres has a mildly violent impulse just in her thoughts, that thought is then communicated through this race of telepaths, and ends up being the cause of several murders. Just before her sentence of lobotomy is carried out, Tuvok uncovers a black market of violent thoughts that exonerates B'Elanna. While it's not the Federation's job to interfere in judicial systems of other races, this is totally one Janeway should have just pulled the justice and beamed B'Elanna to safety. Number 2. Court of Gender. In a reverse analogy to LGBTQ issues, a planet of supposedly genderless beings persecutes those that choose to live a life of traditional binary lifestyles. I say supposedly because you almost get the sense that government propaganda has simply convinced the population that there is no gender. This episode was the best service paid up to that point in the franchise to non-binary issues. Until the courtroom part of the episode, where Soren is sentenced to treatment, which is an analogy to conversion therapy, and I'm sad to say it works. Riker even tries to save her, but he's too late. The Pray the Straight Away crowd already lobotomized Soren, and the episode ends on a not-so-satisfying note. A dishonorable mention for Michael Burnham being on trial in this weirdly adversarial process for the purposes of science, to the point of her own mother as her counsel turning the questioning hard on her for the purposes of absolute candor. The worst entry in courtroom Trek. Justice for Wesley. In the best use of disobeying the Prime Directive, Picard has to save Wesley Crusher from the dumbest death sentence ever handed down on television. Apparently, Tasha Yar bungled this one big time when she was too horned up during their initial survey to read up on the random punishment zones in place on the planet, with only one penalty: death. Some youth on the planet basically set Wesley up to fail, and the rest of the episode is spent dealing with the moral quandary over whether to save Wesley from the least sensible race we've ever seen portrayed in Trek. Thankfully for Wesley, Picard doesn't want the death of both a father and his son on his conscience. Now, for the best in court Trek. At number 5, staying relevant. While most of the actual courtroom proceedings in this episode are a sham, it does give us a good look at 24th century legal proceedings. And in the end, Picard is able to use them to keep the Federation on a path of relevant justice. Former Distinguished Admiral Nora Satie comes out of retirement to conduct hearings into a spy aboard the Enterprise. And a subsequent accident in engineering, even though the two things turn out not to be connected, she expands the hearings into a witch hunt, in a bid to somehow stay relevant in Starfleet. The way Picard defeats her arguments with the words of her own father, a Federation judge, is one of the best moments for Picard in all of TNG. Number 4, Worf's bad day. During convoy escort duty, Worf's command decisions are called into question when the Defiant destroys a Klingon ship seemingly filled with civilians. The Klingons send a representative to plead their case, played by the wonderful recurring Trek actor Ron Canada. Both sides play a bunch of legal games against the other before it's discovered that this was all a ploy by the Klingons to get the Federation to give up territory in their ongoing conflict. I'd like to hope that despite his legal victory, Worf learns the virtue of patience as a commander. Number 3. The Cage Reimagined. Adding a courtroom drama to the original TOS pilot, The Cage, made it much more compelling, and sets up Pike ending up in the beep chair. The menagerie shows us the most serious charge the Federation can bring against Spock for going to Talos. It's the only crime that carries the death penalty, which seems weird and arbitrary, but the way Spock defends himself in an inquisition that in the end didn't matter anyway was a really nice way to reuse the original pilot and give Spock some connection to Pike. Number 2. Synthetic rights. When Starfleet tries to order Data to undergo disassembly at the hands of Bruce Maddox, his right to choose even remaining in Starfleet is put to the legal definition of whether synthetic life has the same liberties as flesh and blood citizens of the Federation. While Data is granted the right to make choices as an individual, the judge was not ready to convey that upon all sentient artificial life. The rights of synthetic life are later taken up by the Doctor in his quest for equal treatment. Measure of a Man is almost the best piece of courtroom Trek in the franchise. I've got an honorable mention for the Klingon court in the Undiscovered Country and its retread in Enterprise's Judgment. The best courtroom episode of Trek? Death Rights. Janeway gets caught in the middle of the Q legal system when they encounter a Q imprisoned in a comet requesting asylum. The captain has to weigh the ethics of granting someone asylum that's most likely going to kill themselves or interfering in Q justice. John Delancey reprises his amazing role to speak on behalf of the Continuum, and it gives us our first look at a version of what the Q call home. No other ruling rendered across Star Trek has galactic-altering consequences like Kate's. She eventually gives this Q asylum, and he follows through with his original plan, with the unlikely help of our more familiar Q. I think Janeway did the right thing, but it had galactic-altering consequences. What was the aftermath from all the supernovas during the Q Civil War? What's your favorite courtroom drama across Trek?